It was really quite by accident that I started Biocon. It was because I couldn't get a job as a brewmaster. Why can't I create a research services sector out of biotech and bioscience? That's always been my sense of purpose. How do I put India on the map of the world? I was the disruptor in the world. The rest is, of course, history. Bangalore is a very special city. It is a city of, for, and by citizens. Ask our investors. They keep telling us, why are you wasting so much money in R&D? It's so risky. Shareholders don't like you to invest in R&D. You're denying us profits. We want dividends.
Kiran, absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. You need no introduction, but I think as an entrepreneur, I'll have to tell you that you've been a garage entrepreneur much before entrepreneurship became so famous in the last 15 years. And I thought it'll be nice to also have people understand what a true first generation entrepreneur from the city, really championed, and how did this whole thing happen. And it's great that we're having this conversation now where everybody's saying this is the India moment. And do you think that finally the moment that we were all looking for our country and to have our rightful place again in this world, is that make you proud today? And is that something that really you think we have as one of the best opportunities?
Prashant, first and foremost, thank you for that very, very kind and generous introduction. As a first generation entrepreneur, especially out of Bangalore, I've always been very, very optimistic of this moment. Okay. The fact that it's now finally being recognized, of course, makes us all very, very proud. But I never doubted the fact that we could put India on the map of the world very well in terms of global leadership. I set up my company quite by accident, as you know, in 1978. And as I built the company, I saw the country also go through enormous change. So, I started my company at the height of the license Raj. Okay. And then in the 90s, I saw this wonderful economic reforms being announced. And ever since then, of course, I've seen the country unleash its potential. Now, when I look at what's happened in this millennium, I think that was really the turning point, because that was the start of the tech revolution, not just in the world, but in India. The IT sector started being visible, started being globally recognized. The phenomenon of we will be Bangalored became very, very evident.
And how much of
that
rub-off or inspiration was there, Kiran, from what you were seeing in the IT to what you were doing?
Let me be very honest. I started Biocon even before Infosys and other, software companies took root in Bangalore.
These were almost parallel streams.
So we were both growing together, and I always believed that we were intertwined. I never saw biotech as being a separate tech space, so to speak. I always thought that it was synonymous with information technology.
Innovation, that is both.
So I just felt I was looking more at it from a point of view that these are new age businesses with new age technologies backing them and with new kinds of talent, resources that required to grow them. So I looked at it in a very different way. I didn't look at it as IT and biotech. And I think I was the only biotech company. So drawing inspiration from each other was the done thing. I think people celebrated many of the things that I did just as much as I celebrated a lot of what the IT sector did. And of course, I was very inspired by the IT sector. But there was nothing for me to really emulate in many ways, except I will tell you, and honestly, I must confess this, that in 1993, when I set up Syngene International as India's first research services company, it was borrowed from that concept of software services.
Right.
And I just asked this question.
Yeah.
If IT could create this software services sector
from India for the rest of the world,
why can't I create a research services sector out of biotech and biosciences?
Right.
So that's what actually led to Syngene, because I felt it was a very logical kind of business model. And that's what I did. And it's now become a huge success, and it catered to a huge, huge need that, the whole global pharma space wanted and required.
So in fact, I think it's nice that you took what was probably not very high value services that was being offered in IT and applied it to a space which was much higher in terms of what we are capable of doing in it.
Yeah, and let me tell you, biosciences and the kind of research services that we offer to these companies is very, very high tech, and it involves very complex skills.
True.
So whilst IT is really at that time was just about coding and very, very simple, basic stuff, biosciences was far more complex.
True.
So those were the skills we had to put in place, and today, of course, we have all these very complex integrated skill sets which are just sort of moving the needle, and we are getting to a higher and higher level of competency when it comes to research and innovation.
Great.
How easy or difficult was it to sell India in the 90s, like Syngene that you set up? Like tech story, one knows, how difficult it was for Infosys of the world to go sell an idea to the world. So how easy or difficult was it for you to do this from India?
It was very difficult. And it still is very difficult, because let's face it, building up credibility in an area where you're not known to be an innovator, but more like a sort of basically a follower, is a difficult challenge. But, we had to start telling people that we had these skills and that they could leverage it very effectively for, furthering their own pipelines. So I think it was difficult. There is a little bit of a bias towards research services companies from Europe. But I think the pendulum is swinging back to taking us seriously, because of the decoupling that is taking place between US and China. I mean, China, let me tell you, actually took advantage of globalization and had suddenly decided to build credibility on scale, on sheer scale and dominance because of that scale. So I think China managed to create that credibility very, very rapidly. So what it gives me, to understand is that you can build, global credibility with sheer scale, which is what our IT software services sector has done. Today, our IT software services sector is so huge in sheer numbers and in the number of companies that operate in this space that we dominate the world. Right? And we've earned the credibility. So much so that even in Hollywood movies, if they want an IT expert, it's an Indian. So I think that's the same kind of credibility we need to build in pharma. In pharma, we have the scale. So we are the generics capital of the world, the pharmacy of the world, whatever we want to call it. But the fact that we don't innovate enough has kind of left us a little behind in terms of that credibility that we need to acquire. Biotech, again, is now becoming a very, very hot area where I think there is a lot of innovation taking place, but it needs to scale up. That's why I think our company, Biocon, is the only global scale biotech company out of India, because the investments are so deep and the way you manage talent is so different to the typical kind of Indian pharmaceutical enterprise.
Do you want to dwell on Biocon and tell us a bit about the journey that Biocon had? And since the 70s, you've also evolved, pivoted, reinvented, and you are still very, very relevant as one of the largest or the largest biotech company. So tell us a bit about the journey. ma'am?
Yeah, like Malini, I told you that it was really quite by accident that I started Biocon in my garage in 1978. Literally, it was because I couldn't get a job as a brewmaster for which I had qualified myself from Australia. And having been rejected and feeling very dejected, I guess I started Biocon. Now, in the early stages, of course, it was about enzymes, because I was very familiar with enzymes, having learned the use of enzymes and the fact that the brewing process is all enzymatic. So, in the early, I would say for the first 2 decades, that is from 78 to 98, I really focused on developing enzyme technologies for a host of industries. So, for instance, I developed enzymes for the starch industry to convert starch to glucose. I developed a huge number of enzymes for the fruit juice industry, for the food industry, for the textile industry. I also developed a large number of enzymes even for bioremediation and effluent treatment. So it was a large, number of diverse industries that I had developed enzymes for. And one of the industries that I had also developed enzymes for was the pharmaceutical industry. So I had developed a lot of digestive enzymes for pharmaceutical industries. But then I got an opportunity of leveraging my enzyme technologies for really being seriously involved in pharmaceuticals. And that kind of led to entering into biopharmaceuticals in a serious way. So it wasn't about enzymes. Now I wanted to use fermentation technology to actually make pharmaceutical molecules. And so the first set of molecules I looked at was, of course, statins and immunosuppressants, because I could leverage some of my enzyme technologies very easily. But the real change or shift or pivot happened when I started developing recombinant human insulin. Now, the 90s and the early part of the millennium, I realized that, there was a huge unmet need when it came to insulin. We were the diabetes capital of the world. And all insulin dependent patients were relying on imported insulin. And that too, because insulin was so expensive, recombinant human insulin, that is, they were actually using animal insulins, porcine and bovine insulins extracted from the pancreases of cows and pigs. I just thought that's absolutely, unacceptable. Because animal insulins are good, I mean, they work. But the fact is, they are immunogenic because they are not human insulin. Yeah. And here was a biotechnology which was developing recombinant human insulin, and it was so expensive that we couldn't even afford it. So I just felt I had to do something about that. And interestingly, I had a yeast technology on which I was developing enzymes. And I said, why can't I use that to make insulin? Because you have to be agnostic to when you're making anything out of a recombinant platform. After all, you're developing a protein, and an enzyme is a protein, and so is a insulin, a peptide. So I said, okay, let me try it. And of course, it worked. And because, India had this huge opportunity to develop its own recombinant human insulin and finally break that kind of monopoly that the Western insulin companies had on India in terms of controlling high prices, I was able to disrupt the business. I mean, this whole model. And I was able to then develop insulin at a fraction, in fact, a tenth of what I could price it at, a tenth of what the multinational companies were at that point offering recombinant human insulin in India. And the rest is, of course, history, because I was the disruptor in the world. I mean, today, if you go to any developing country, the price of insulin is very affordable. And today, because of affordability, access to insulin has been made so easy. And today, nobody in India uses animal insulin. They all can use recombinant human insulin. And of course, based on that insulin platform, I developed insulin analogs, and now I market my insulins globally. I'm really proud that we're the fourth largest insulin company in the world. And of course, we have a presence in the most advanced markets like US and Europe and Japan and Australia and the whole developed world. But we also cater to the developing world, Latin America, Africa, Asia Pacific, and every other part of the world. So I think that's what's really been very exciting for me. I think not too many Indian people realize what is happening here in our own city of Bengaluru. And then, of course, moving on from insulins, I got prompted into looking at more complex biologics like monoclonal antibodies. And that was a very coveted technology. And again, we basically developed very high-end skills. And again, we've become one of the most respected and recognized players in bringing not only biosimilars, but also novel biologics to global markets. So I think that's what has allowed us to harness the talent, pursue very strategically global opportunities, and try and put India on the map of the world for biopharma by just doing all these things in a way that puts us on par with everyone else. I think that's what's always been my raison d'etre. And that's always been my sense of purpose, saying, how do I put India on the map of the world, not as a number 2 or number 3 country, but right on top? I think that's been the philosophy and culture in our city, that we want to be the best.
Kiran, if you kind of just fast forward and see the entrepreneurial ecosystem around biotech, and we have some common companies that we've all invested in the novel biologic space, platforms for these molecules, novel molecules. It has been a challenge. The lack of an ecosystem, like the startup revolution that happened in let's say SaaS or e-commerce and some of these other areas has not been easy to replicate. I think it's because it's more complex, like you said.
Much more expensive.
Much more expensive. There's maybe a whole ecosystem in Boston that doesn't exist here. You need maybe so many of these other parts. Do you see something we can overcome in the next decade or so to see a lot more successful entrepreneurs like you in the biologic space, in a sense, being able to maybe straddle that cross-border innovation pipeline that has not been easy?
Yeah, so I think you ask a very important question, Prashant, and I think if I was to answer that, I would start with the ecosystem. You keep referring to the US ecosystem.
Right.
And the US ecosystem is a self-perpetuating virtuous cycle, which is really about having VCs backing ideas. Those ideas being taken to the stock markets.
Yeah, very early. I mean,
early,
immediately after your phase 2.
Yeah. And investors being excited with early stage development. Unfortunately, we don't have that ecosystem. And of course, the government also has played a very important role in making sure that they're part of the ecosystem, because a lot of these early stage ideas are emanating out of academic research.
Right.
And academic research is always bolstered by a lot of NSF funding, NIH funding. And a lot of the clinical development takes place with a lot of this kind of support. Now, unfortunately, in India, we've kind of made two silos of private research and public research.
Understood.
And that is, I think, very unhealthy. And, the private research is viewed with a lot of suspicion and with a lot of resistance, I would say, for funding, for government funding. And public research is basically supported with a lot of funding, but it doesn't connect with private sector.
The translation
in terms of translating that research into a commercially viable idea or a product. So I think we have to first fix that. Secondly, I think VCs in India and investors in India have been very spoilt by very quick returns. In
very low hanging fruit to their opinion.
Because they all want to back low risk ideas. So services companies do very well because there's no risk of the returns,
and
right?
immediate consumer money. Kind of applications and consumer.
No, but even in services, if you ask me whether it's a diagnostic center or a research services company, it's about getting more business and
that everybody's comfortable.
And there's no losses being mounted, right? If you look at novel companies, the investment needs for developing novel molecules is so high that it's like a bottomless pit in terms of investment in the early stage. And you don't see your return for several years, which is not what VCs here are used to. So they want to see quick returns, and those quick returns are not visible for the foreseeable future. So what happens is most of these companies finally give up, or they basically take their ideas to the US.
Right.
And then they develop and shape those ideas in the US and they raise capital. And I'll give you an example. I myself spun off a very interesting company based on a very novel asset that we had developed in-house in Biocon. But we realized that developing it in India was not going to be the right thing to do, because we would not be able to raise capital. It would hit our P&L and it didn't make sense. So what did we do? We spun off a company in Boston called Bicara Therapeutics, and we parked all this asset and IP in that company. And of course, this company has managed to raise a lot of capital, venture capital. And they're now in Series B, and their data is looking very good. They did all their development in the US, the clinical development, even though the product is being supplied from here. But the fact of the matter is I could not have done it in India. The ecosystem doesn't allow us to do it.
I think
India.
That's the playbook is very different.
Yes, and Bicara will look at, either spinning off the asset or going to the public market very soon, just because the system supports it, right?
So looks like we just have to do things very differently to make this kind of startup.
And if you actually look at the opportunity we have in this country to correct all these things, it's huge. We should do it, because I am very convinced that research and innovation will actually drive non-linear growth. Without that, you will just have incremental growth. And I think you need to get into innovation like we've seen in the tech space, right? So I think that's what I'm hoping, that can we see some really interesting, incentives or ecosystems developing, which are led by some new policies that allow these companies then to mimic what they see in other parts of the world.
I mean, the example in Glasgow that you have funded, the collaborative, cross-disciplinary kind of thing. I mean, something like that can happen between what's happening in the public sector and in the private sector, a research center like that, Kiran.
Well, it can happen. There's nothing that stops it.
I want to talk a bit about that.
About
what exactly is
Mazumdar-Shaw.
Well, we basically, my late husband and I, we made a philanthropic gift to John's alma mater, which is Glasgow University. Glasgow University is one of the oldest universities in the world. It was, in fact, founded in 1451. So it's amongst the oldest universities.
And that's one common. My son went to Glasgow, so I'll have to put in that plug.
So we made a gift to them, and they actually were very kind enough to, they came to us saying that they were creating a new campus. And in the new campus, they were creating this multidisciplinary research center, which was aimed to basically foster new age innovation, where you don't do research in silos, but you bring it all together. So, for instance, they have a wonderful division for AI and all the latest data science and data analytics that goes with it. along with high-end life sciences research, high-end, physics, mathematics, you name it. So there are multidisciplinary researchers in that building. It's called the Mazumdar-Shaw Advanced Research Center, ARC, they've called it. And it's great to have your name there, in such a wonderful center. And I just went there, and you realize what is possible. And that's what makes it very exciting to think that this could happen anywhere if you really thought about it. But I go back to the point, you can create such centers anywhere, but what makes them successful is the thought leadership. So you need very engaged faculty, and the director of that center should be a visionary. So that's what you need here. You can, it's not the bricks and mortar that counts. It's really the kind of research that goes on and the kind of people you bring into that ecosystem. And I can tell you, we are beginning to do that because, we are putting up Science Gallery Bengaluru, which is really modeled along the same kind of lines, saying we want to connect science with society. We want to basically make sure that this is a multidisciplinary science gallery, which basically focuses on making people understand or get interested in science. So evangelizing science in society, bringing the spotlight on new technologies, and getting researchers to come spend sabbaticals in that in the center, and start collaborating with the academic research centers in Bengaluru. Now, what is really important for us to remember is we are blessed because we have so many research centers, academic research centers in the country, in the city. We are the science capital, we are the research capital of this country. Okay, we have so many scientific institutions and research institutions, and if you can get them all to talk, and we want Science Gallery to be that nodal point where they will all talk and they will take on projects and programs where they all collaborate. That's the intent. So if you can make that happen, it can become an arc, right? And we have right now very good leadership at the helm of Science Gallery, Jahnavi Phalke. Yeah. She is a real thought leader. She's a science historian. And if you listen to her, you get so, inspired, because she actually talks about the fact that C.V. Raman, our Nobel laureate, was not as if he had a research lab and he did everything in by himself. No. He actually, after he graduated, he went to Calcutta and he was actually serving in a government audit body. And he was literally a clerk. He was an audit clerk doing some government accounting. But he was so interested in science that there was a public lab facility in Calcutta. Calcutta was ahead of Bangalore by the time, in the early 1900s, by the way. But the public lab infrastructure that they had created in Kolkata for scientists to come and engage and deliberate and brainstorm was where he also used to spend every evening experimenting with his thoughts in his subject, in physics. And that's what led to the Raman effect. So you can see how these public spaces and public labs actually foster the scientific temper that leads to innovation. And that way I'm very optimistic about Bangalore. We will lead the world in innovation, and we are leading the world in many ways in innovative thinking.
You spoke about innovation, and large companies in India still aren't investing as much in the R&D. Biocon does over 10%.
But the problem is, Malini, we are crucified for investing in innovation and R&D. Ask our investors. They keep telling us, why are you wasting so much money in R&D? It's so risky, right? We are shareholders. Shareholders don't like you to invest in R&D. You're denying us profits. We want dividends. We don't want you to waste your money in R&D. VCs in India and investors in India have been very spoilt by very quick returns. Bangalore is a city of first generation entrepreneurs. So we came with no baggage. I was being told that bribing is just a part of the business. I candidly asked them, I said, is it true that you have to bribe a lot? Now, you don't want the usual thing of developing a great road and somebody digging it up. Today, if the government actually wants things done, they come to private sector.
What about you as a woman entrepreneur, Kiran?
I never looked at it as being lonely. I looked at it as being unique. I agree the world is not fair. It's tougher for a woman. I think the world is ready for them.